He spent 19 years with the man who would inherit his death. In the winter of 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius lay burning with fever in a military camp on the Danube, and he called his son Commodus to his bedside, not to comfort him, but to warn him. What he said in that room would be remembered for 2,000 years. What Commodus did with those words would destroy everything his father built. The name of the place was Vindobona. Today we call it Vienna. In 180 AD, it was a Roman legionary fortress on the northern edge of the empire, the last line between civilization and the Germanic tribes pressing down from the forests. It was cold, perpetually damp, and it smelled like smoke and unwashed wool and something else, something that had been in the air for 15 years. That something was the plague. Stay with this story, because in about 12 minutes, you're going to hear the specific words Marcus Aurelius said on his deathbed, and they are not what any historian expected. They are not comforting. They are not peaceful. They are urgent, and they contain a technique for confronting your own mortality that I want to give you before this video ends. To understand why Marcus died the way he did, you have to understand what the Antonine Plague actually was. It arrived in Rome around 165 AD, carried back by soldiers returning from the Eastern campaign against the Parthians. The historian Cassius, writing in the early 3rd century, described it as the greatest plague in human memory. Modern epidemiologists, examining the ancient descriptions, believe it was smallpox, and it was unlike anything the Roman world had encountered before. The symptoms were recorded in clinical detail by the physician Galen, who was in Rome when it struck. Fever, black diarrhea, skin eruptions, pustules that hardened and then fell away, leaving scars. Galen watched patients die in their thousands and took notes with the detached precision of a man who knew that understanding the disease was the only form of power he had left. He eventually fled Rome for his hometown of Pergamon. He was not alone in running. At its peak, the Antonine Plague was killing an estimated 2,000 people per day in the city of Rome alone. The death toll across the empire over the full 15-year span has been estimated at 5 million people. Some historians say more. It struck the military hardest because soldiers lived in close quarters, shared water, shared food, and had no way to isolate the sick from the healthy. Marcus Aurelius, commanding on the frontier, watched his legions hollow out from the inside. Here's what most people do not know about Marcus Aurelius. He never wanted to be emperor. He never wanted to be a general. When the Emperor Antoninus Pius died in 61 AD and left him the throne, Marcus was 40 years old. He had spent most of his adult life reading philosophy, writing letters, and studying law. He wanted to be a Stoic philosopher. Instead, he became the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, and within months, a plague arrived that would define the rest of his life. The Meditations, the private journal Marcus kept, never intended for publication, were written almost entirely during these war years, between 161 and 180 AD. Not in a palace, in military tents, in camps like Vindobona. When you read a passage like Book 2, Section 14, even if you were to live 3,000 years or 30,000, remember that no one loses any other life than the one being lived now. You are reading words written by a man who had watched thousands of people lose exactly that. Their only life, right in front of him. 4 minutes in, and I want to pause on something that should unsettle you. Marcus Aurelius is celebrated today as the philosopher king, the wise ruler, the Stoic sage, but the historical record shows something more complicated. He was exhausted. He was often ill himself. And in the final years of his reign, he made a decision that Stoic historians have argued about ever since. He chose to keep his son Commodus, a cruel, vain, and unstable young man, as his heir. Why would the wisest emperor Rome ever had make that choice? The answer lies partly in Avidius Cassius. In 175 AD, a false rumor spread across the Eastern Empire that Marcus had died. A Roman general named Avidius Cassius, governor of Syria, immediately declared himself emperor. He had been one of Marcus's most trusted commanders. The revolt lasted only 3 months before Cassius was killed by his own officers, but it shook Marcus to his foundation. If there was no clear named heir, every ambitious general in the empire was a potential Cassius. This is where a man named Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus enters the story, and he matters more than most people realize. Pompeianus was a general from Antioch, not from Roman aristocracy, a man who had risen entirely through military competence. Marcus trusted him completely. He gave him one of the most significant honors possible. He arranged for Pompeianus to marry his daughter, Lucilla. Marcus wanted Pompeianus close. Some historians believe Marcus actually preferred Pompeianus as a successor to Commodus, but Marcus never made that choice. He named Commodus co-emperor in 177 AD, when Commodus was 15 years old. He brought the boy to the Danube frontier. He tried to teach him the discipline of command. Cassius Dio, who was a senator and witnessed the transition, wrote that Commodus was not naturally wicked, but simple-minded, and that he fell under the influence of corrupt companions. Marcus saw this. He was not blind, and yet he did not change course. By the winter of 179 AD, Marcus Aurelius was 58 years old, and his body was failing. He had never been physically robust. Throughout his life, he suffered from chest pains, stomach ailments, and what the sources describe as a recurring weakness that would today likely be diagnosed as an ulcer or possibly the early stages of tuberculosis. The plague had circulated through his camps for years, and now, in the bitter cold of the Danubian winter, the fever that came from Marcus Aurelius did not leave. The Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies written in late antiquity, records that Marcus refused food in his final days, deliberately hastening his death. Whether this is historically accurate or later embellishment is debated. But what is recorded more reliably by Cassius Dio is that when his doctors and servants came to his bedside on the 6th day of his illness, Marcus turned away from them, covered his head, and said, "Why do you weep for me? Think rather of the plague and of the deaths of many others." That sentence tells you everything about who this man was. He was dying, and he was still doing the Stoic practice. He was still, in his final hours, directing his own attention away from his personal suffering and toward the larger reality. This was not performance. This was not a man putting on a brave face for history. Marcus had been training his mind to do exactly this for 30 years. Since his Stoic teacher Epictetus's disciple Rusticus gave him the discourses to read when he was around 25. By the time he was dying, the practice was not an effort. It was simply who he had become. Now here is the moment I promised you at the beginning. Here is what Marcus said to his son. According to Cassius Dio's account in his Roman history, Marcus called Commodus to his bedside and spoke to him about the duties of an emperor. He told him the army respected strength, but it respected justice more. He told him the empire would only survive if Commodus understood that he served Rome. Rome did not serve him. And then, in words that Cassius Dio paraphrases but treats as authentic, he said something remarkable. He said, in effect, "I am going to the place from which I came, but you are staying in a world that is harder than it looks from the throne. Do not let the power make you forget that you are mortal." This was memento mori, remember that you will die, spoken not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a father's last practical advice to the man who would rule 30 million people. Marcus knew what forgetting your mortality did to emperors. He had watched it happen. He was trying, in his final breath, to prevent it in his son. It didn't work. Commodus would reign for 12 years, increasingly erratic, increasingly cruel. He renamed Rome after himself, Colonia Commodiana. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules and appeared in the arena as a gladiator. Pompeianus, the son-in-law Marcus had trusted and honored, eventually withdrew from public life entirely, unable to watch what was happening. In 192 AD, Commodus was assassinated by a conspiracy that included members of his own household. The line Marcus had built ended in disgrace. But here is what did not end: the meditations. The private journal Marcus kept during the plague years, during the war years, during the years of watching his empire suffer and his body fail, those survived. They were never published in his lifetime. They circulated in manuscript form for centuries. They were first printed in 1559, 1400 years after his death, and every generation since has found in them the same thing: a man in impossible circumstances, practicing every single day the discipline of thinking clearly about what matters. In Book 4 of the Meditations, Marcus wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." In Book 6, "Perfection of character is this, to live each day as if it were your last, without frenzy, without apathy, without pretense." These are not motivational quotes. These were instructions Marcus was writing to himself on the Danube frontier, with a plague killing his soldiers and a war that never seemed to end. He was not writing for posterity. He was trying to survive the day without losing his mind. Around minute 9, I want to stop and ask you to hold something in your mind. Everything you've heard so far. The plague, the dying soldiers, the failed son, the deathbed warning. All of it points toward a single question that Marcus spent his entire adult life trying to answer. If you know that time is running out, how does that knowledge actually change what you do today? Not in theory, not in philosophy, in practice, in the decisions you make before noon. That is the question Act 3 of this video is going to answer, with a concrete technique. Keep watching. To understand how the memento mori practice actually worked for Marcus, not as philosophy but as daily technology, you have to understand what he was doing in the meditations at a structural level. Each morning, often before dawn, Marcus would write, not diary entries, not reflections on how the previous day went. He was writing instructions for the day ahead, based on a practice his Stoic teachers called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. He would think through what could go wrong, who might frustrate him, what suffering he might witness, and then he would think through his own death. This was not morbid, this was strategic. In Book 2, Section 14, the same passage I quoted earlier, Marcus lists all the great men of history who are now gone. Alexander, Julius Caesar, Augustus, all their courts and philosophers and warriors. He lists them not to be depressing, but to make a specific point. They all thought they had more time than they did. And the ones who spent that time on things that did not matter left nothing behind that mattered. The ones who spent that time as if each day were genuinely their last, they left something real. There's a specific phrase Marcus uses in the Meditations that most translations soften, and I want to give it to you straight. In Book 12, Section 23, he writes something that translates roughly as, "Everything harmonizes with me that is harmonious to thee, O universe. Nothing for me is too early nor too late, which is in due time for thee." He was not writing this as a beautiful sentiment. He was writing it as a command to himself. Stop fighting the fact that death is coming. Use the time you have. Now. Now here is the moment we cross from 180 AD to right now. From the frozen Danube to wherever you are watching this. Because this is the question that should be making you uncomfortable. What would you do differently if you had 1 year left? Not 1 day. The 1-day version produces panic, not wisdom. 1 year. Enough time to be deliberate, enough time to actually change something. That is the time frame Marcus was working with in Vindobona. He knew the fever was not going away. He had roughly weeks. But let's give you a year. Most people, when they hear this question, go immediately to experiences. Travel, adventures, bucket lists. But that is not what Marcus Aurelius did. And Marcus had the resources to do literally anything. What Marcus did was strip away the false obligations. The Meditations reveal a man constantly identifying what Epictetus called externals, things outside his control that he had been treating as if they were inside it. The opinions of courtiers, the outcomes of battles, whether his son would be a good emperor. He kept returning to what he could actually govern, his own judgment, his own actions, his own response. Here is the concrete situation I want you to consider. You are in a job that does not align with what you believe you are here to do. You have been in it for 4 years. You stay because the money is reliable, because changing feels too uncertain, because you keep telling yourself that next year you will figure out the alternative. Marcus Aurelius in Book 3 of the Meditations would call this a specific failure, not of courage but of attention. He writes, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. The action you are postponing does not require more deliberation. It requires a decision." Here is the second situation. You have someone in your life, a parent, a sibling, a friend, with whom something important has gone unsaid, not unthought, unsaid. You have the conversation rehearsed. You have found every reason not to have it. It's not the right time. They're not in the right headspace. It will be awkward. You will revisit this next month. Marcus Aurelius watched the plague take people with no warning, no final conversations, no last words. He built an entire philosophy around the question, if this were the last day, what would you leave unsaid? The Stoic answer is nothing. Nothing important. Nothing that actually needs to be said. Now I want to give you the technique, not the philosophy, the actual practice. It is called the 1-year letter, and it draws directly from what Marcus was doing in the Meditations. Here's how it works. You sit down, not on your phone, not at your desk while multitasking. You sit down with paper and a pen, and you write a letter from yourself, 1 year from today, to yourself right now. You have just been told you have 1 more year. You are writing back to today. You write, what did you stop doing? What did you start? Who did you call? What did you stop pretending was not a problem? The reason this works, and it is not original to me, this practice appears in various forms from Seneca's letters to modern cognitive behavioral therapy, is that it bypasses the abstract. When you ask yourself, what would I do with 1 year left? Your brain hedges. When you write from the future, you commit to specifics. You cannot write, I would probably think about maybe changing careers. From the future, you write, I quit the consulting firm in March. It was the right decision. The specificity forces honesty in a way that philosophical reflection alone does not. Marcus Aurelius did a version of this every morning. He wrote forward into the day ahead, premeditated the obstacles, committed to specific principles of action, named the specific virtues he intended to practice in the specific situations he would face. He was not writing general intentions. He wrote, as in Book 5, Section 1, in the morning when you rise unwillingly, let this thought be present. I am rising to the work of a human being. Not a philosopher, not an emperor. A human being doing what humans are supposed to do. Act. At minute 14, I want to tell you the thing about Marcus Aurelius's death that most YouTube videos about him leave out. Because it is the detail that changes what his life means. When Marcus Aurelius died in Vindobona on March 17, 180 AD, he was not surrounded by philosophers. He was not in a garden reading. He was in a military camp, sick with plague or fever, surrounded by soldiers and physicians who could not help him. He died at the frontier. He died still working. He had not yet finished the war he came to fight. That detail matters because of what the Stoics called the distinction between the preferred and the chosen. Marcus preferred peace. He preferred his library, his correspondence with his teacher Fronto, his time with his family. He chose, or accepted, 19 years on the frontier because the role demanded it, and he had decided that the role was his responsibility. He did not romanticize the sacrifice. In Book 5 of the Meditations, he writes about waking up tired and telling himself that the bees do not complain about working. Neither should he. It is not beautiful. It is honest. Here's the journaling prompt I want to leave you with. Not a reflection question, a writing assignment. Set aside 15 minutes tonight or tomorrow morning before you open your phone. Write at the top of the page. If I died at work on what felt like an ordinary day, what would be unfinished that actually mattered? Not your task list, not your inbox. What would be unfinished in your relationships, your commitments, your sense of who you were trying to become? Marcus Aurelius had an answer to that question every single day. It was in the Meditations, in the practice of writing it down. Do you have an answer? There's one more piece of this story I want to give you before we close, because it is the piece that I find the most quietly devastating. After Marcus died, his body was transported back to Rome. The army mourned him, genuinely mourned him, not with the performative grief of courtiers, but with the grief of soldiers who had watched him eat what they ate, sleep where they slept, and share the same cold and the same danger for nearly 2 decades. Cassius Dio writes that the soldiers called him the father of the legions, not the general, the father. That title tells you what kind of leader the Stoic practice produces when it is practiced genuinely and not performed. It does not produce distance and detachment. It produces presence. Marcus Aurelius was present to his soldiers in the same way he tried to be present to himself in the Meditations, without flinching from what was actually happening, without retreating into denial, without pretending the plague was not killing them, or the winter was not brutal, or the Germanic tribes were not pressing harder every spring. He was there, in full, with clear eyes. That is what memento mori actually does when it works. Commodus did not receive the same title. Commodus was the gladiator emperor, the Hercules, the mad. He had forgotten, or perhaps never believed, his father's final words. You are mortal, and that means every day counts, and every day you spend being less than you are capable of being is a day you cannot get back. Marcus spent 19 years practicing the belief that the days were finite and therefore precious. Commodus spent 12 years proving what happens when a ruler forgets that. The Antonine Plague killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. It weakened the Roman army at a critical moment and contributed to the instability that would, over the following century, accelerate the empire's long decline. Marcus Aurelius could not stop the plague. He could not cure it, could not contain it, could not protect the people who died from it. What he could do, what he did, was show up every day in a way that was honest about the limitation and still chose to act within it. That is the whole of Stoic philosophy, reduced to a life. If you take one thing from this video, let it not be a quote. Let it be the image of a 58-year-old man, feverish in a military tent on the Danube, turning away from his doctors and saying, "Think rather of the plague and of the deaths of many others." That man had every reason to collapse into self-pity. He was dying, his empire was struggling, his son was going to ruin everything. And in that moment, in the actual final moment, the practice held, the training held, the philosophy did not fail him when he needed it most. That is the promise and the challenge of Stoicism. It does not work in the moment if you have not practiced it in the ordinary moments. Marcus was not calm at his death because death arrived and he coped. He was calm because he had practiced for 30 years, in his journal, in his morning routines, in the 10,000 small moments where he chose to be honest about impermanence instead of hiding from it. The one-year letter, the morning premeditation, the question about what would be unfinished. These are not tricks, they are the practice, and the practice is the point. Vindobona is Vienna now. There is a busy city above the place where Marcus Aurelius died, full of people living exactly the lives Marcus wrote about in the Meditations, distracted, rushed, certain that the important things can wait until next year. The legionary camp is mostly underground, excavated in pieces beneath the old city. You can visit the ruins. You can stand in roughly the place where the last great Stoic emperor spent his final days. Most tourists walk past without knowing. Most of us walk past the question Marcus was asking every day without knowing either. Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, the final section. Time is a river of vanishing moments, and its current is swift. Nothing is trivial that touches on how we are to live. He wrote that during the plague. He wrote it for himself. But he also, without meaning to, wrote it for you. Watching this in whatever year you are watching it, in whatever circumstances, with whatever time you have left and do not know. The river is moving. The question is not whether it moves. The question is what you build on the bank while it does. If this video gave you something worth keeping, the best thing you can do is write that one-year letter tonight. Not because it will solve everything, because the act of writing it will tell you, in your own words, in your own handwriting, what you already know matters and have been choosing not to see. That is the gift Marcus Aurelius gave himself every morning in the Meditations. It is available to you for the cost of 15 minutes and a piece of paper. He did it in a plague. You can do it tonight. If you want to go deeper into the Meditations, start with Book 2 and Book 4. Those are the sections most directly concerned with mortality and time. Gregory Hayes's translation, published by Modern Library, is the most readable in contemporary English. Cassius Dio's Roman History, specifically books 71 and 72, gives you the historical Marcus, the one on the frontier, not the philosopher in the library. Both Marcuses are real. Both are necessary, and both are, ultimately, the same man trying to do the same thing you are trying to do. Live without wasting the time he had. Thank you for spending this time here. The next video in this series will cover the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, a man born into slavery who taught the most powerful people in the Roman world how to think. He taught the most powerful people in the Roman world how to think. His story is, in many ways, the story that made Marcus Aurelius possible. If you found this one worth your attention, that one will be worth your return. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and go write that letter.